All right, everybody, let's try to get started. I'm going to get in big trouble if I keep us here too late tonight. Guy who takes care of the building was mean me before. So I'm going to be mindful of the time, and I hope you all are too. Thank you for coming. This is the second edition, or the second week of the Detroiters Speak Summertime Edition, Beyond 1967, the Citywide Citizens Action Committee. Our first panel dealt with the issue of policing in post-rebellion Detroit, and this panel is entitled Capital Punishment, Deindustrialization, Automation, and the End of the Line. And what this is an extension of trying to look at the ways in which the powers that be dealt with rebellion in Detroit. We saw a punitive turn last week when we were looking at post-rebellion policing and operations of stress and kind of the increased militarization of the police locally. And then this week we looked at kind of the price that was paid in terms of daring to rebel at the job site. You know, Detroit was the home of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, DRUM, LRUM, as we'll hear about in a little bit, but also in the 70s, innovative means and ways to try and deal with the crisis of capitalism that was occurring at the time. So we have a distinguished panel with us tonight. I'll try and introduce them in order. I'll get out of the way so they can do their thing. First up, we have Austin McCoy from University of Michigan, who has a fancy titled fellowship, I believe. What is the full name?
It's the Michigan Mellon Humanities Postdoc.
Yeah, see, that's too much. I'm going to make Austin for the night the honorary H. Rap Brown Fellow in Urban Rebellion. Welcome. It's good to have you here. And then next to him, of course, we have Jerry Goldberg. And Jerry was involved in struggles against deindustrialization, organizing workers at the point of production as the wave of plant closures kind of collapsed on not only the city, but the entire region. And he's, of course, a local activist and stalwart politically. Next to him, we have Alonzo Chandler, who was a founding member of LRUM, which was probably the single most important kind of revolutionary union movement formation in the late 60s that led to the creation of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And then this was obviously black workers organizing at the point of production and really stopped production cold when they organized that plant. So Alonzo's going to talk to you about organizing LRUM's connection to the previous organizations such as DRUM and to the League itself, but also the price that was paid for his activism in terms of moving forward and trying to continue working in the automobile industry in the years that followed as the plants began to close. So if you all would join me and welcome everybody, give everybody a hand to start. I'm going to pass the mic to Austin.
Thank you, David. Also wanted to thank the organizers this semester of Detroit and thank my other panelists. Today, I'm going to talk about the Detroit Alliance for a Rational Economy and the 1979 Chrysler bailout. And so I'm lapping everybody, so to speak, when it comes to thinking about the rebellion. But the Chrysler bailout in '79, I think also constitutes a form of, capital punishment, which was the title of today's talk. So I'm going to, I wrote something up and I'll read it because I will ramble if I don't. And I don't want to waste anyone's time. So on May 30th, 1979, Chrysler announced the closing of its Dodge main plant in Hamtramck. This plant was the largest in the metropolitan area, and at its height it produced more than 10,000 cars a week. In the late 1950s, the factory was among the metropolitan area's largest employers, as upwards of 20,000 people worked there. Almost 2 decades later, Dodge Main employed less than half of its 20,000 workers, and in the last few years of its existence, it laid off its remaining 8,600 workers. The closing was symptomatic of a larger structural problem in the corporation and in the national auto economy. After years of mismanagement, years of economic and energy crises, and months of staggering losses, the Chrysler Corporation was on the brink of failure. So in the summer of 1979, the corporation's leadership, Mayor Coleman Young, Republican Governor William Milliken, UAW President Doug Frazier, and others trekked to Washington with hat in hand to appeal to Congress and President Jimmy Carter for a bailout to save the corporation from bankruptcy. So how many of you in here, y'all remember the 2009 bailout, right? So how many of you in here knew about the first one in 1979? Right? A few folks, none of the younger folks remember or aware. So this was the first time this happened with Chrysler. And Dodge Main's closing was pretty ironic considering the factory's political history. In the late 1960s, Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM, declared in one of its newsletters, and this is a quote, "The factory is a tool of violence used by the union and management to crush all resistance put up by the workers." During the 1950s and 60s, black workers throughout Detroit's plants dealt with the corporation that discriminated and exploited them. They had to work the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs. They had to contend with not only automation, but with what some drum activists called niggermation, which was a racialized form of the speed up where management expected fewer black workers to perform labor previously reserved for more white workers. So they would argue that, instead of 2, 3, or 4 white workers performing a single task, one black worker was expected to perform that same task. Black laborers also contended with racist surveillance and policing inside of the plant. The firm had its own protection services, and then outside of the plant, they had to contend with the Detroit Police Department's intelligence units, as well as the FBI, who often spied on them, especially as they organized. So on May 2nd, 1968, more than 4,000 workers responded to these conditions by participating in a wildcat strike, which paralyzed Dodge Main. The corporation mostly held black workers responsible, firing and suspending dozens, yet immediately after the strike, General Baker, Mike Hamlin, John Watson, Kenneth Cockrell, Luke Tripp, and others formed DRUM to organize against these terrible working conditions and racism within the union. The RUM spread throughout the metropolitan area's factories, and in 1979, however, a decade of economic crisis and job losses encouraged leftists and workers to save and transform these tools of violence into spaces of economic democracy. So 11 years later, Kenneth Cockrell and others in the Detroit Alliance for a Rational Economy confronted plant closure, or as some scholars have called it, right, like this lean production where they're trying to constantly slim down the workers or the workforce within the corporation. Again, it's a sort of scaling up of this niggermation sort of labor regime. They also resorted to austerity as another weapon against black workers' communities. And Cockrell and Dare mounted their critique of Chrysler and plant closure in city council through writings, including their pamphlet, Chrysler, the City and the People, and by organizing the conference. The Detroit Alliance for a Rational Economy argued that the Chrysler bailout underscored capitalism's tendency to undergo periodic crisis. And in sort of Marxist parlance, this is sort of the theory of, capitalism, it's the theory of periodic crisis, right? Like capitalism is constantly, undergoing. So in that, you have the 1979 in the auto industry, 2007 as well in the auto industry. But rather than the bailout, Dare saw economic democracy as the answer. I refer to economic democracy as grassroots participatory decision-making in the economy. This concept extends beyond the sort of top-down administrative strategies of economic planning. For example, like the sort of Keynesian economic model that was popular, between 1945 and 1973, as well as collective bargaining. This form of politics also challenged capitalist private property rights. So when a society organized around this idea, community members and workers should run economic institutions and have a say in technological investment and plant location. And in Dare's case, they not only called for public representation on Chrysler's board of directors, they also advocated for Detroit workers to take over Dodge Main and convert it for production for social needs. So proponents of economic democracy also criminalize capitalist behavior and actions such as labor exploitation, workplace deaths, the use of police to discipline workers, and deindustrialization. These behaviors are products of the criminal state, which is a union of capitalists and state institutions, and this union often commits systemic crimes against humanity. For example, resource and labor extraction, war and imperialism. But Drum and the League also argued for a form of economic democracy, one that combined a radical vision of industrial democracy with an anti-racist and anti-imperialist critique of capitalism. They too criminalized corporate capitalism, as the organization asked in the newsletter, and this is a quote, "What about the looting? The real question is, what about the looting by big corporations, the looting of exploitation, the looting of racist practices? On the question of the speed up, the worker's life, health, and self-respect is being looted away from him by the company." So like as you hear, right, they're sort of flipping the language that the state often uses against Black folks who, participate in uprisings, anyone who participates in collective violence, as, most folks, most of us in here know, the state, holds a monopoly over collective violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of Dare, and then I'll talk a little bit about Chrysler and then Dare's response. This is a very short presentation with many gaps, many holes. And I know that there are folks in here, especially folks who have lived through this moment, who can talk about this, a lot more of this, in a more compelling way than I can, as I'm, just looking at archival records, doing research, maybe doing some interviews. So obviously, when this is all done, I expect to hear an earful from some folks. If I don't, catch everybody's name or catch every single thing that happened. And I don't say that to be, a smart aleck or anything. I'm just trying to recognize, what I'm doing and the sort of gaps that might be in this work. So I actually welcome folks to, if you have something to add, if you say, Austin, you're wrong, feel free to do that. Perfectly fine with that. So, as far as the historical context of Dare is concerned, the organization represented a culmination of a decade of leftist political organizing in the city. Several of the organization's founders, Ken Cockrell, Sheila Murphy, Jack Ravitz, Jack Russell, and others, participated in the local Black Power movement, as well as white leftist organizations that arose out of the '67 rebellion. Like I said earlier, Cockrell was involved with Drum and the League and the Black Workers Congress. Sheila Murphy was involved in anti-police brutality work. Justin Ravitz was a white Marxist judge on the Recorder's Court. And in 1977, Cockrell, as well as many of these folks that were participating in this cohort, decided to support Cockrell in his run for city council in 1979, an election that he won, and he, at least outwardly ran as a independent socialist, and he ran on, mostly, some of the principles that I'll outline later on, such as, workers controlling plants, right? Trying to critique Mayor Coleman Young's redevelopment policies, especially those policies that focus on downtown riverfront development. So regarding the 1979-1980 Chrysler crisis, while Dare represented a zenith of that sort of organizing, and again, another caveat, this isn't the only form of leftist organizing that's going on, in the 1970s. You have the Boxers, you have folks who are still running, participating in communist politics, especially folks like General Baker. So like, again, this is just like one stream of politics that I'm talking about. So like, while that represented a zenith for that particular cohort, Chrysler's request for federal aid marked the end of a financial turbulence for that particular automaker. Geopolitics, federal regulations, the opening up of U.S. markets to international competition stymied automobile production in the U.S. during the 1970s. And out of the big three, Chrysler was one of the more vulnerable automakers to these sorts of economic pressures. Like I've already said, mismanagement plagued the corporation. The Chrysler continued to continue to produce and release full-size vehicles despite a weak consumer demand. The corporation lost over $300 million during the national recession in 1974-1975, and then it lost $207 million in the first quarter of 1979. So subsequently, Chrysler and others went to Congress and asked for a $1 billion tax credit. And it was a request that Congress refused. Just like Congress in Nixon or Ford's Treasury Department refused a bailout, or a full bailout of New York City when it endured its financial crisis in 1975. So much was at stake, with this bailout. Detroit housed 15 of Chrysler's plants. The corporation employed 37,000 residents, which accounted for 7% of the city's total employment. It employed 74,000 people and owned 21 plants in the metropolitan area. And as Mayor Young stated in his testimony to the House of Representatives, Chrysler was the largest private income generator in the city. The corporation paid $1.1 billion in wages, salaries, and benefits. And Chrysler's Detroit workers paid nearly $280 million yearly in federal income taxes, which according to their calculations amounted to $40 million in revenues. So after months of negotiation and debate, President Carter signed the Chrysler Corporation Loan Guarantee Act, which actually awarded $1.5 billion in loan guarantees to the corporation upon the condition that it raised another $2 billion in loans. And then what was contingent upon these loans and this bailout was actually rolling back many of the wage and benefit gains that workers had won over the last decade, 20 years, since 1950. So, workers were always expected, and this is something similar in the recent bailout, right? Where it's like workers are always expected to pay the costs, for, the corporation's, mismanaging of its own capital. So DARE's response. The organization responded to the Chrysler crisis by applying pressure within City Council. They organized a conference and published articles critiquing the bailout. They saw this as economic violence. This was a tool of austerity, and it was enacted upon Detroit residents and workers. But then they also began articulating ideas of economic democracy, or in their language, principles of what they considered a quote-unquote rational economy. So DARE grounded their critique of the bailout in Marx's crisis theory. They argued that Chrysler's failure and subsequent bailout reflected capitalism's tendency to descend into economic crisis periodically. The organization declared in its pamphlet, and this is a quote, "We in DARE do not care whether or not the formal entity called Chrysler survives. Our concern rather is with saving jobs, and in the process, with developing public understanding of the inevitability of crises, such as Chrysler's and capitalist economies, and of the haves versus have-not struggles that determine who pays for the solutions." DARE argued that the loan guarantee represented a weapon of austerity, capital punishment, if you will. They maintained that the loan's terms would stimulate pressure for service cuts and would be joined by demands for reduced worker compensation benefits, unemployment assistance, and the like. The organization also stated, "We shuddered at the impact of this package on another impoverished corporation, which they called the City of Detroit, which had been forced to lay off workers," right? So they're recognizing even how Mayor Coleman Young was resorting to firing public sector workers in the city, right? He representing actually a rather austere mayor rather than the sort of like mid-south, you know, Detroit or blue cities as being like, you know, wasteful when it comes to government spending. So with DARE, also the bailout amounted to a corporate and state looting of Detroit. And, you know, this is sort of, you know, not the exact language that Drum was using 10 years ago, because Drum's politics were rather to the left of DARE's politics, you know, by the end of the late 70s. But this is what the organization said. And this is a quote: "The federal rescue plan devised by Chrysler, by Congress and the President is a lesson in the power of private capital. Billions of taxpayers' dollars are held ready to save, for the time being at least. A mismanaged and tottering corporate entity and securities financiers, while the workers who have produced the wealth of the corporation are permanently stripped of $462,500,000 in resources." Members of the organization saw the crisis as an opportunity, though, to push for greater corporate accountability. Cockrell stated in an editorial, "The crisis that affords us an opportunity to build in some safeguards against unchecked corporate decision-making, especially when it came to closing plants and shifting production inside as well as outside of the state and the country." So like the UAW, DARE demanded popular representation on the Chrysler Board of Directors. The organization's activists envisioned their demand as a step towards challenging corporate private property rights, rather than just being a token on the board. The group also advocated for long-term economic planning, plant conversion, and production for social needs. Finally, the city should take steps to secure funding for a truly comprehensive and bold planning effort focused on developing the capacity to convert plants, such as Dodge Main, to production of useful, undersupplied goods and services needed by the people of Detroit, declared DARE. The suggested several potential products that, they included converted plants could manufacture mass transit vehicles and parts. Yet, however, the organization did not elaborate on any decision-making process or plan by which the city workers would convert, run, or control the plants. DARE's proposals illustrated the organization's desire to establish a form of governance that was, you know, distinct from liberal Democrats, but then also distinct from folks who were sort of beginning to try out what we sort of call neoliberal principles of governance, which is, you know, rolling back the welfare state, privatizing everything. So, in conclusion, DARE's response to the Chrysler bailout contained a crucial flaw. In the late 1960s, the revolutionary union movements in Detroit argued that blacks' positions within the industrial economy offered them a source of power. If black workers organized themselves, they could bring production to a halt, right? And this was like the theory of, you know, to the point of production. In 1979 and 1980, however, DARE expressed important critiques of Chrysler, but they relied mostly on electoral politics and community organization. And their strategy faltered because they failed to organize black workers within the plant, you know, which is sort of an irony, or maybe not, depending upon how some folks feel about, you know, Mr. Cockrell and the organization. You know, so really one of the lessons is, you know, at least at this moment in the late 1970s, you could have community organization and electoral politics, but you also needed to actually organize the workers, especially if you were going to try to launch a critique, you know, of a corporation, you know, that is, you know, that employs on workers, right? I mean, so like that was a glaring sort of irony there. I mean, so the, you know, DARE failed to generate the grassroots support needed to critique, you know, the bailout. Only 130 people attended the organization's conference, and then like after this conference, the membership levels of the organization began to decline. And, you know, so the conference is in March 1980. By 1981, Ken Cockrell decides not to run. DARE disbands soon after. You know, but despite all of this, DARE's criticism of the loan guarantee operating as a weapon against the city's workers appeared pretty prescient. While Chrysler endured, the city of Detroit and many of the corporation's workers did not survive the bailout. Chrysler employed over 100,000 workers throughout the U.S. in 1979, yet in 1981, Chrysler's employment dropped by 30%. Austerity and layoffs hit black workers the hardest. African Americans held 33.6% of the corporation jobs in 75 and only 27% in 1981. And in 1980, Chrysler operated 38 plants in the U.S., 22 of them located in the Detroit metropolitan area. Yet Chrysler closed 15 U.S. plants, and 12 of them that were closed were in Detroit. Consequently, Chrysler's employment in the Detroit area fell by 26% between 1980 and 1982. So, I mean, that is sort of like the culmination of like the capital punishment that Chrysler and the U.S. government sort of enacted on Detroit. But then the critique was pressed in another way, as I already pointed out. They were right to apply this Marxist crisis theory to the situation, as the Big Three found themselves at the brink of collapse again in 2009. I'm done. Thanks for listening.
So goes next, and then you'll clean up. Lonzo. I thought it'd be good because we had a question about Ken Cockrell organizing workers, and I thought this would be a good moment for you to intervene, talking about your experiences as a black worker in Eldon with Ken Cockrell organizing workers. So I'll leave you there. And
You want me to address Ken Cockrell?
no, I want you to address organizing Eldon and the league, and if Ken played a role in that.
No, okay. Let me do it like this then. Ken and the crux of people like Ken, which we come to call the petty bourgeois section of our movement, they help to organize and help people like General Baker, who I think everybody knows, that spearheaded the drum movement. General Baker, a lot of people you really should get a hold of for some of these forums, people like Ron March and the core people from drum that spearheaded that. Because I was working at Eldon, and I was not actually a founder of Eldon. The Eldon group come along after General and all of them were the ones that organized the workers. Chuck Wooten, Gerald Wooten, Chuck Wooten's brother, Ron March, and people like this that worked at Dodge Main. And so as their movement spread, other plants in the area, Elrom and Ford being the next two that came into the fold, started to understand that maybe we had a role to play as we contacted General and them. It was not Kenneth Cockrell and them that organized us. It was General, Ron March, and people of that sort. Particularly for me at Elron, it was a guy named Charles Wheaton and some more people that helped, Donzel Williams, and some more people that helped organize me. And we have, I don't know if you have a poster with you, but we have a poster that went out on South End with James Edwards, myself, and a couple other people, Robert McKee. And so they helped organize me, and then I came into the fold. So since there are a lot of young people here, and this is part of a community thing, then I want to just do a little brief thing so you'll get a really good understanding. Because they go back to '79 when Chrysler had the bailout. I go back to the early '50s, and the reason for that is because I'm old. In the early, because it's always good to have some type of economic perspective. In the early '50s, Chrysler was in trouble. In the middle '50s, I'm sorry, Chrysler was in trouble again. Chrysler had actually become number 2 up under General Motors. The old man at Ford was fired by his son, and Ford was boosted up to number 2. So Chrysler was in trouble again. Also, what most people do not know is that we were in an economic crisis in the middle '50s during the Republican administration of Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, who was the vice president. And so my uncle, for example, to give you a personal example, my uncle was working at Chrysler. He was laid off in 1957, toward the end of 1957. He didn't see Chrysler again until 1962. That's how deep the crisis was. If you look at auto production from 57, 58, 59, you look at the numbers, you can go on the internet and look at the numbers, you will see why the economy was in such bad shape. Because back then, the factories produced like throughout the economy, because we're still dealing with industrial economy, not a robotic and what they have now in computers. You're dealing with industry. And so those industrial jobs, you're talking about rubber, you're talking about glass, you're talking about steel, they generated so many jobs throughout the country that the country was in a recession again. So Chrysler almost went under then, but there was no bailout. And by the time the economy picked up after Kennedy was elected in 61, the economy really didn't pick up until around 62, 63. So what they did, they called back the people that were laid off from the 50s first, my uncle being one of them, before they actually started hiring people again. Again, you can go on the internet and look at the seniority list. So what happened between starting somewhat in 63, but beginning to peak in 65, you started to have a large influx of blacks coming into the factory, because the people that started the union back in 37, and where the union was recognized out of Flint, were mostly Anglo-Americans of different persuasion, Italian, Greek, this, that, and the other. And so now what happened, the second and third generation people from the old country, their kids were going to college. They were becoming doctors, lawyers, and different things like this, different professions. So what was happening in 63, 4, and 5 is you started getting you got an influx of blacks coming in the factory, because my parents and the people from my generation, they had come from down south and they had migrated up here. And the reason why they had to do that is because the tractor and automation and some other things actually got them off and out of sharecropping. So they had to have somewhere to go. And so they came into the factories a little bit, like my uncle, and then we inherited those factory jobs in bulk, being black. That posed a real problem, because the corporation wasn't ready to give us equal rights. The corporations were still stuck in a bad period in terms of safety. And now I'm going to get to Eldon, for example. One of the things that spurred the Eldon strike when we struck was that the conditions were so bad because they were still using high-lows that ran on gasoline engines and oil. And so oil spills would be all over the floor. And they didn't want to repair them because they needed to have the pick up loads and do this, that, and the other. And so a repair was sketchy. As a result of this, a woman was hit by a high-low. Her leg got infected and she died. Then the second fatality came when, back at that time, any foreman could tell you to do something, you're supposed to do it. A black hollow driver who had just come back from Vietnam was told by a foreman, not here, I need a load, I need to keep this line running, go get a load. Well, because of all of these faulty hollows, the hollow tilted over and the load crushed him to death. At that point, not only with all of the racism, all of the foremen were black during that time, and this is part of the lesson that all of us need to learn. Mostly all of the foremen were black. The union officials, the head union officials were black. The few that they had at the International, the ones that had the most power were the ones from Ford, and that's a whole different story. I don't want to get into the Ford story, but the other ones were like underlings. So the white power structure pretty much ran everything, and so And so as Dodge Main started their thing, and then we came in with them, and then we struck, and we even won over a lot of the union officials, the black union officials that were working at Eldon. But what happened when the strike was over with, we, the Elron people, did not get back to work. The union people looked out for the union people, and they came back to work. So as a result of that, in terms of a personal level, a lot of us, General Baker included, who got fired at Dodge Main, we had to assume different names. Couldn't do that today because of the computer thing. Well, we went and got names of dead people and all kind of stuff. We went and got assumed names in order to work somewhere else. I went out, for example, I went out to Jefferson, and I worked under a guy by the name of Gary Maxey, and I worked under his name for 2 years, and eventually I got back into my name. But a lot of the lessons learned, some of this is factual, what I just gave you, and some of it is my perspective from being in the league. The movement that we did spurred so much stuff. A lot of people were able to stand up. The election of Coleman A. Young, even the election of Kenneth Cockrell, the election of different blacks all throughout the country, Carl Stokes over in Cleveland, all of this was spurred by those things that transpired really coming up that Dodge Main strike, if you really look at it. And part of the lesson of that is that what we really did, now this is my perspective, what we really did is we finished off the civil rights movement, which in my opinion started with Jackie Robinson breaking the color line, and then really got to rolling with Rosa Parks. And then it really picked up momentum when Emmett Till was murdered. It was like, okay, we've got enough of this. But what was so important about our movement is that at that time, blacks were at the crux of industry. And we could shut down any industry in the country. And I remember one of the Chrysler executives saying, this will never happen to us again, because at Eldon, for example, we did all of the axles for the whole corporation, as well as we even did axles for General Motors. And so, but again, the lesson to be learned is when we left the industrial era and went into the computer and robotic era, all of that became almost null and void. Because now, for example, for the first time, I said this last week for those that weren't here, for the first time in the history of the United States, they really don't need black people anymore. And so the assassinations by the police, because that's what they are, and even what's going on in the neighborhood, they don't care if you kill yourself or they don't care if they kill you. Because they don't need us anymore for the crux of what needs to be done. Because a robot and a computer, and they're going to keep coming out with bigger computer chips, and the jobs all across the board, not just in industry, but everywhere, they're going to vanish. So they've got a real problem. Because what this is based on money being able to generate, it's based on money being able to circulate, but it's based on goods being able to generate and circulate. Because computers and robots don't create value. They create product, but not value. Only human beings can create value, because if I create something, then I've got to buy something. I buy a house. I have kids. I buy clothes for my kids. I help my kids with their education. A robot doesn't buy a house. A robot doesn't have a 30-year mortgage. A robot doesn't buy a car. You don't have a 5-year car mortgage. And a robot's kid is only going to replace him, and he's going to make greater profit. So these are things that you have to consider as your generation, because our generation had a different fight, because we lived in the industrial era. And so that's just some perspective on what went on back then and versus what's going on now. But you have to pose the two. And if you want to do some further stuff, a lot of this goes all the way back to the Bretton Woods Accord that they made after World War II. Because what they did, I mean, look, the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans were all fascist countries. And they fought a fierce war against these people. But they did not want socialism. They didn't want Russia dominating anything, or whatever they may have called socialism. And so they pumped all of those countries up. So if you line things up, when he talked about the bailout in '79 and Chrysler coming in trouble again, there's no coincidence. There's not a coincidence that this was the same time that Japan and Germany had completed their renaissance, so to speak. So now, all that old industrial stuff that they had was vanishing. All of the plants that they had were brand new. Even this, what they call it, they bring a part in and they don't have these huge inventories. That was actually started by an American that went to Japan and helped the Japanese apply that system. And the Americans only applied that system after the 80s when they became in trouble with the bailout. So you have to look at it in the sense of the transition from the industrial period to the computer period, because that's the same period that Japan and all of them, and then as you notice, that's also the same period that those Japanese cars and German cars began to dominate, and their technology. Now, if there's any other questions. I did not know. That's all right. But if there's any questions, that's pretty much. Now I got some buddies over there. Mitchell, who worked with me, and Russell over there, who is also part of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And all of you can also, there's a website up now called the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And you can go. Well, I'm talking about they worked in the plant. And Mary Creighton was General's wife, and she was instrumental in Black Star and all that other stuff. But that's a different area. But if anybody wants to make any comments, feel free. If anybody has any questions.
We're going to do question and answer after. Save your questions. I want to give us time so we can talk about this. I want to let Jerry have a chance to talk about organizing what's done and set these meetings.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed the presentations I heard, and particularly hearing from one of the organizers in the league, which played such a great role here. My name is Jerry Goldberg. In the late 60s, I was one of the leaders of Ann Arbor SDS, and back then SDS wasn't the SDS of Tom Hayden and participatory democracy. It was a revolutionary organization, it was a Marxist organization, and we believed in the overthrow of capitalism. And we had a very strong SDS in Ann Arbor, but by 1970, those of us who led it, we knew that our place as revolutionaries wasn't in a petty bourgeois town like Ann Arbor, and we had to go to the working class, which was the only agent of revolutionary change. And in 1970, about 35 of us moved to Detroit, and we formed many revolutionary organizations, some of which still exist, some of which fell apart. I was with a group that formed the Workers' World Party. At that time was Youth Against War and Fascism, and I'm still a member of Workers' World, and we're still active today. When we came to Detroit in the early 70s, Detroit was the greatest city you could be in if you were a revolutionary activist. It was a cauldron of struggle, and it was really a cauldron of the Black liberation struggle, where almost all the groups were here. Republic of New Africa, the Black Panthers, and of course, as was just explained, in many ways the zenith of the Black liberation movement was the League, where the Black struggle merged with the workers' struggle and was based on the power of the Black workers to be able to shut production. And I remember one summer, and I think it was '74, just in a period of a month, you had two workers, Shorter and Carter, took over the power plant. '73, took over the power plant at Jefferson Assembly over the racist foreman firing some black workers. We're surrounded by 5,000 workers and won that struggle. A few weeks later, there was a great wildcat strike at Detroit Gear and Axle. I believe General Baker was one of the leaders. If not, he was the one we met with when we went out there to support it. And about a month later, there was a takeover at the Mack Avenue stamping plant. Actual sit-down strike in the Mack plant. That was all in 1 month. That was Detroit in the 70s. At that time, I got hired in at the Michigan truck plant, which was a Ford truck plant out in Wayne, Michigan, about 30 miles outside of Detroit. The plant I got hired into was actually about 85% white. It was a very, very exploitive plant. We built pickup trucks. And it was the most, when I got hired in, it was the most racist place I'd ever seen in my life. My ears would burn from the language of many of the white workers. But what was interesting in that plant, it was a lesson I never forgot. Within a short time, we formed a caucus in that plant among black workers, progressive whites, revolutionary whites, because once they met whites who came out of the revolutionary movement, they could at least recognize at least we weren't the hardcore racists as everyone else, and Arab workers too. And back in those days, you have to remember, whenever it got hot in Detroit, the workers would walk out and shut down the plants. Where I was, where the committee was all white and you had the white workers, they were afraid to walk out. You had many wildcat strikes emanating out of Detroit all the time. And the white workers saw it. They saw what was going on in Detroit. And you know, they decided they wanted some of that in their plant as well and needed some of it. And within a couple years period, we elected a committee in a plant that had never had one black committeeman. There was 5 black committeemen out of 7. And it never went back. It was always led by black leadership in that plant. And it wasn't that the white workers had some moral awakening, but it was that the material conditions that they were facing, the exploitation day to day, pushed them to link up with the black struggle, which was the forefront of the workers' struggle for all workers at that time, and especially in the auto plants. We had a lot to talk about the Chrysler bailout, but to me, the most significant part of the Chrysler bailout was that there's no question that Chrysler in 1979 was the first of the auto industries to really put into scale, large-scale deindustrialization, reindustrialization, and technology. But the important point was how they carried it out. They used that introduction of technology to destroy the power of the black workers. And it was a conscious policy, I'm absolutely convinced. They kept the plants open in the suburbs. A lot of them are still open. If you drive up and down Van Dyke in the suburbs, you still see big auto plants that are open. But they shut, as the brother said, they shut virtually every assembly plant in the city of Detroit. And the reason they did it was both, of course, to destroy the power of the black workers, but it was also to destroy the militant base of resistance in the UAW as a whole. And I'm absolutely convinced that the UAW leadership, when that occurred, as much as Doug Frazier wanted a piece of the board, that they put a wink and said, go ahead and do it. Because it destroyed the militant opposition that existed in the union at the time. I remember going to a meeting over Dodge Main, because everyone saw that Dodge Main was kind of the core of the struggle. Saving Dodge Main was a big campaign. There were huge demonstrations. Angela Davis came out here, and I remember going to a meeting. We sat around, and everyone raised, let's make Dodge Main, Save Dodge Main should be the first demand in the UAW contract. But the leadership wouldn't do it. They let Dodge Main shut, and once Dodge Main shut, Lynch Road shut. If you go up Mount Elliott and look at the Lynch, and you'll see nothing but fields now. Those were thousands of young black workers who were working, who had jobs. And it shows how capitalism and restructuring the racist character of that in this country. The second big wave of restructuring that occurred was in the mid-'80s when GM in 1986, in December of 1986, General Motors announced that it was going to go through its big restructuring and announced the elimination of a shutdown of 11 plants, mostly in Detroit and Flint, and the elimination of 20,000 jobs, and that mushroomed to thousands more. When we heard about that at that time, one of our members was in the Fleetwood plant. And right away, he formed the Stop Plant Closing Committee in the Fleetwood plant, and the Fleetwood plant ended up shutting. We made calls to Flint, and we found an activist in Flint. Her name was Lizzie Love, who organized a committee of auto workers in Flint. And we formed what was called the Job is a Right campaign. And the perspective we put forth back then was that a job is a property right. A job is your property, it belongs to you. And we cited to Francis Perkins, who was the Secretary of Treasury in the 30s, who actually articulated that idea of a job being a property right. We also cited if you study the sit-down strikes, you'll see Maurice Sugar was one of the leaders of the UAW. And of course, the UAW was a communist union then, was propagating the idea that a job was a property right. It was the ideological route for taking over the plants. And what we were agitating for is that if it's your property, you have a right to defend your property against anyone who wants to take it. And we were agitating for massive plant takeovers to stop the shutdowns. We had a large rally in Flint. It was the biggest rally since the sit-downs at Harris Auditorium. We had a national conference against plant closings. We actually got Congressman Conyers to introduce a bill for a moratorium on plant closings, to say that a ban on plant closings of any plants of more than 100 workers. And we went around the country working this idea really on a completely grassroots level to do it. And we busted up the governor's conference. We had a tent city of the unemployed. Of course, Governor Blanchard was the governor there. So anyone thinks Democrats and Republicans are anything different, I don't think too many people really think that. And it was a big struggle to assert the right of workers to their jobs. During that time, it was interesting, Jesse Jackson launched his presidential campaign. And when Jesse Jackson launched it, he went to Fleetwood. And he spoke to a big rally of a couple thousand workers organized by the Stop Plant Closings Committee. And he got up and he gave just a terrible speech, Japan bashing, Buy American, all that crap. And the workers met with him afterwards. So you want to take that line in Michigan, you ain't going nowhere. You got to talk against the corporations. It isn't the Japanese that are taking our jobs. It isn't Buy American. It's the corporations, the capitalists that are taking our jobs. And you know, he changed his tune, developed a completely anti-capitalist tone in that campaign, and in fact, built the Rainbow Coalition and had his greatest success ever in Michigan. His biggest victory in 1988 was in Michigan. I remember going to those rallies, and there were black workers and white workers and LGBTQ. It was a real coalition based on a program of challenging the corporations and particularly challenging the plant takeovers. Of course, the capitalist class saw that, and right after that, they started Jaime-baiting him and all this crap to destroy him. But people should keep that in mind. Right. The point I'm trying to make is the lesson to me, the great lesson I learned in my early days as a revolutionary and ever since, is the critical factor in building a revolutionary movement in this country is solidarity with the most oppressed, solidarity with the most oppressed who will lead the revolution. The black workers, the Latino workers, the Arab workers. And the potential is there to do it. And it's not going to come just by a moral transformation of whites. It'll come when white workers recognize that their material interests are in solidarity with the workers for the most oppressed who will lead the struggle.
That's right. Amen.
A lot of times people, I look at the current period a little differently, a little less pessimistically than some others. The character, as the brother said very correctly and eloquently, value comes from labor, from the exploitation of labor. And profit comes from surplus value, from the value that's extracted from the worker who produces much greater value than he's paid for his job, or he or she is paid, than who's paid for the value of their labor power. When technology comes, the effect of technology is to lower the wages for the whole working class, because that's the only way the capitalists can keep making power, making profit. So what are we seeing in the age today? Where is the workers' movement today, where it has its greatest strength? It's in the Fight for 15 movement, the movement among the most oppressed workers, the poor, lowest paid workers who are leading the way. It was in the immigrant struggle. Who revived May Day in this country? It was immigrant workers, the most exploited workers, led the way in reviving May Day in this country. And one of the things I thought was very significant, anyone who looked at the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations, they were led by militant, revolutionary black youth, but there were many whites and LGBTQ people following that leadership, solidarizing it. Because the fact of the matter is, if young whites have no future in this system, well, where are they going? If you go to school, mostly what you end up with is tens of thousands of dollars of student debt, and you end up working for Starbucks or McDonald's if you're lucky. I feel the potential exists for a revival of the working class movement based on the most oppressed sectors of our class. those are the hardest hit, taking the lead. And I think that movement, and in many ways, Trump represents that to the opposite.
Here, here.
Because what does Trump show? It's these white workers who've been disenfranchised by the system, but without any leadership, with a reactionary union movement that sits down with Trump, that echoes Buy American and corporate policies, it's not out there with the youth when they're storming the gates, fighting police brutality. We need to form a new leadership. And if we form that new leadership, don't get me wrong, I believe in fighting these fascists and racists if we have to, and smashing them whenever we can, but we also can win over a lot of them too. And we're going to win a lot of them. And we should have confidence. And I really feel strongly about it. You know, technology is a two-edged sword. Let me end with that. In the 1930s, as early as the 1930s, 1937, within the UAW, the demand was raised for a shorter work week, 30 for 40. Think about it. Today, with all this technology that should be making work less and less and easier for people, the work week is getting longer. Where is the demand for the shorter work week? We need to revive it. In 1970, remember when I worked at Ford in the 70s, we actually went on strike for a shorter work week. And we want a very modified form of it where we have one day a week a month, you had a shorter, 1 week a month, you had a shorter work week. But you know what? The workers loved it. And they had to hire tens of thousands of workers just to fill in. In France, they had big strikes just a couple years ago to demand a shorter work week. And the struggle now is to try to crush that movement.
That's right.
Technology in the hands of the working class, in the hands of us who produce everything, should be a tool to liberate us, to turn work into something we do for a short time while we live for most of our lives. That means challenging the system, that means challenging capitalism, that means building a movement that understands solidarity with the most oppressed, with immigrant workers, with Muslim workers, and particularly with Black, Latinx, and people from the oppressed, like Native workers, building a movement based on that solidarity that can be a class movement that can challenge the system. We have nowhere to go. They're going to destroy the planet, you know, in a number of years. It's time to build a revolutionary movement. That's the lesson of the 60s and 70s. There was a revolutionary movement. It wasn't strong enough to overcome reaction at that point. But today, the conditions in many ways are even more ripe for it because the basis for class unity is even greater, even as it looks dimmer. I feel actually objectively it's greater. And let's build that movement. And let's learn the lessons, the great lessons from Trump, and I know changed my life and changed many activists' lives to see what the role they played. But let's bring those lessons into the current period in reviving the class struggle.
I want to thank you guys all, and I want to thank everybody here for your patience. I know it's hot, and so thank you for bearing with us here. I wanted to go get some questions. Anyone have some questions, and I'll go around with the mic, and we'll kind of see what we come up with we can discuss.
Thank you. I enjoyed all of your insights. I studied engineering management at Michigan, ag program, the computer. I'm a computer programmer, basically. It was interesting what you said. I appreciate it. I love Bernie Sanders and what he said. President Trump always said it used to be the cars were made in Mexico. You couldn't drink the water in Mexico, and the cars were made in Flint, and now you can't drink the water in Flint. And the cars are made in Mexico. And I found insight in what you were saying, though, that the computer has levelized the races. Computers don't care what race, religion, sexuality, productivity, the same thing that's hitting black workers in Detroit. You had Le Pen in France and Brexit in England. President Trump admitted that when he met the Chinese Xi Jinping, he couldn't get him to make a single concession. But I just found it interesting. I appreciate what you're saying. I was thinking that really the computer has leveled. They don't care what race you are. The computer's going to tell you what the most productive thing to do is. We might care what race each other we are, but you don't even have to talk to your boss. I go to work, I have to deal with the computer program that pays me. I don't even have to deal with my boss. I just, found it especially insightful when you mentioned, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, let's get some questions now. I'll get the mic back to you.
I don't have a question.
Oh,
I got a comment.
go ahead, please make a comment. Here, I'm gonna give this to them so they can respond.
Hey, look, I didn't know they was paying them for this. Lord have mercy. You gotta put me on the thing, man. Lord,
I don't trust your ass.
I didn't know that, man. Listen, Alonzo, 99 3/4 what he said, I totally agree with. I just wanted to comment on, how did he say it? Anyway, when he said they don't need black people anymore, that's not quite true. That's kind of absolute. They don't need a certain sector of black people anymore. You know what I mean? The part that they don't need, that unskilled, what have you, uneducated, blah, 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 a certain number. And that transcends races, obviously. And they said that. But I just wanted to make clear that we was clear on there's no such thing as they don't need black people in general. People like to make black people one monogamous big old section. We split up into classes like everybody else. And that's one thing I want to get across here. When Dave puts me on the panel, I'm going to do my thing. But right now, I want to make clear to everybody that, gender is not going away. Race is not going away. Culture is not going away. But class is not going away. And a lot of people don't realize, I can't help but say this. When we went on strike at Detroit Ford, that was our lawyer over there. That white guy with the white hair right there. That was our lawyer. And I just wanted to say that the worst thing that ever happened to him when we struck was it was multinational. It was multinational. They were so afraid of that they didn't know what to do. White people and black people and Mexicans and Polish and what have you, arm in arm against the bosses. They were scared as hell. So be careful now. Don't let nobody, and I'm not saying they did, but don't let nobody seep into your head this black thing, this black. When we were the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and what have you, I don't understand why a lot of people don't say we made our biggest leap when we went multinational. That League of Revolutionary Black Workers laid a terrible strong base, just strength, manning. But we formed the Communist League and the Communist Labor Party, and they went on to be the League of Revolutionary League of Revolutionaries for New America. They went on to be. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question while you're holding court? Could you talk a little bit about the CLP and unemployment councils in the late 70s?
No.
Okay. Maybe
Anyway, I'm gonna give up this mic. But anyway, it's so great seeing y'all here. This is my first time here. Seeing you older people is great, but seeing you young people is just the bomb. It's the bomb because it's your world now. It's like our world too. We ain't dead, but I mean, obviously we'll be gone soon. So you got to do your thing. But the system is gone. Capitalism just cannot work. Cannot work. Hey, let me speak next week.
So I have two questions, and it's for the panelists, but you can tackle whatever questions you want, or neither of them. So the first one is there an example or examples in Detroit of workers running a factory after like a strike or anything like that? And then the second one is it possible to create like a leftist identity that's outside of the worker identity, since like the term an identity worker is given by like capitalists to people, and sort of, yeah, those are my questions.
I'm trying to think of the examples of workers who took over a plant and kept it going. I mean, certainly there are examples, I remember in the 60s when the Young Lords took over the Lincoln Hospital, and they turned it into a people's hospital and kept that hospital going and served the people from that hospital for months. I remember recently in Chicago where there was a takeover of a plant. They were ready to shut it down, and mostly Latino workers, and they kept that plant open and it wouldn't let it shut down. It ended up, keeping it open. I'm trying to think of examples, of course, in Detroit, when they tried to shut Detroit General Hospital, one of the aspects in the late 70s, at the same time they shut Dodge Main, they privatized Detroit General Hospital, which was the last public hospital in the city. And there was a tremendous struggle over Detroit General. And it linked to Dodge Main. We had a big rally linking to save Dodge Main with saving Detroit General, and the workers there took over the hospital for a period of time. But whether it's difficult to take over production and keep it going. Now in Venezuela, we see the opposite. In Venezuela, when the corporations, as part of their effort to destabilize Venezuela, which is what they're trying to do right now, when they refuse to produce, the workers are taking over the factories and the government is supporting them. And the government's lending support to them to maintain production under workers' control. So I think the fight for workers, it would have to be linked to a fight against the powers that be to provide the resources and at a point when the movement was strong enough to do that. And I think we will see that. As far as the other question, I think all struggles, but I agree with what was said, the struggle boils down to a class struggle. And the class struggle is rooted in the struggle of labor versus capital. And all struggles, but the working class has many forms to it. The working class is multinational. The LGBTQ, who are LGBTQ people, they're workers. Exploitation of all forms is rooted in private property, and which needs to divide all the workers to maintain itself, and it's rooted over. Most human history is not a history of sex, of women's oppression. It's not a history of gay and lesbian oppression. It's not a history of transgender oppression. Those all came into fruition when the matriarchy was overthrown, when private property replaced communal production. So I think all forms of struggle are related to the working class and the class struggle, which encompasses all these ideas. And I think the world, I know what I'm looking for, is a world which, how most of human history was, a communal world, but based on technology being able, not based on scarcity, but based on plenty, which means we've got to take it over the whole system.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. We were there's no question about it. And those battles were continued. And the thing that we got to remember is that we didn't just form RUMs in Detroit, in the Detroit area. I remember going to Birmingham, Alabama with a bunch of steel workers to form RUMs down there. And it was a national movement that then had a national impact. And the other part which Dave wanted us to speak to was the Motor City Labor League was a revolutionary organization at that time, organizing with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And we got together to form the Communist Labor Party. That movement here in Detroit then had a fundamental movement throughout the country. Because by organizing the Communist Labor Party, we united the whites and the blacks in that struggle. The thing that I learned, however, in this whole process was we always have to look at the counter-revolution. We have to be aware that everything we see, the ruling class sees. They knew damn well that they could not leave plants in the city of Detroit. They had established a different strategy, and they did so. They did the same thing relative to the anti-war movement. They knew damn well that they could not have a drafted army. So what they did, they had a voluntary army. The same thing in terms of school. I graduated from law school with no debt. No debt whatsoever. You graduate from law school today, you got $200,000 debt. Why? Because when I got out of law school, I didn't go to work for the corporation. And most of us didn't go to work for the corporation. And so the corporation said, wait, we got to stop that. When you get out of law school, you come to work for us so you can pay off your debt. It's that counter-revolution that we have to be aware of. And we have to be conscious of how they organize the system so that they continue to control. And it's not about money, it's about control. Because they got all the money. All they want to do is to make sure they have control. And the problem that we have is that what we tend to do is look at our last battle. We don't, you know, a general will tell you you don't fight the last battle. You fight the next battle. And the next battles have to do with the fact that we can't go to a plant out at Ford with 80,000 workers and leave with that plant. That plant has 6,000 workers today. And that's the problem we have. How do we communicate with the class as a whole when the corporate media controls everything they tell us? And that problem is something we have to address. I don't have any real answers, but I do believe that you have to always look at how the counter-revolution is being set up. Because they know everything we know, and they're planning to counter everything we do. And if we look at it from that point of view, I think we'll be more able to develop strategy and tactics which will unite the class. Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions, anything you wanted to ask? Take your shot. What you got? Yep.
So, address the idea of the computer making race irrelevant?
We'll get back to that. I want to let her ask the question, and I'll reiterate that question for you.
Stand up, Val.
Tall enough. Okay, I have two questions. The first one is, well, I don't know, kind of different, but I wanted to know, do you guys know when OSHA started? Did Drum and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers have anything to do with that being implemented on a national level? Any connection to that?
Did you say OSHA?
Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly when it started. Where's Ron? Oh, there you go. Ron, come here and help me out a little bit. Ron, being a lawyer, might know when it started, but here's OSHA. But here's what happened. When we had the strike at Eldon, what we did is we took the OSHA guidelines, because I told you that we had some deaths that happened in the plant because of safety and because of the things that went on. Because one of the things that happened was that it spurred the electronic high-lows and stuff like that, and made them do that quicker and get rid of all those gas and stuff like that. But our strike was based on the OSHA thing. And about that, Ron was our lawyer. Ron fought our case for 10 years. We lost that case on a technicality because the capitalists finally said, instead of going by state law or federal law, you have to go by the federal law, because the state law and federal law were different based on when you started your lawsuit. And the reason for that was that the union sold us out. The union kept telling that, we're going to take care of you. And they did not. And they knew full well that the statute of limitations was different between state and federal government. And that's sort of what we fell down in terms of tactics on our end. But Ryan fought our case for 10 years. I remember going to the last hearing after 10 years, and we lost only because of a technicality of who had jurisdiction. Ryan can speak to that. But let me speak to one more thing, since Ryan had brought up the thing about he doesn't have any answers, and neither do I. And also, Russell spoke to it, it's your world. You people are going to have to figure out how to defeat the Republican and the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party, like I said, has not represented working people since this computer thing has started around 79, 80, 82, which converges with the same thing that he talked about with the Chrysler stuff. It's a trail, but it's not a trail that they're going to tell you. And Obama, one of the big things with Obama is all of the money he got through the internet. He got some more money, but you people are going to have to correspond through the internet correspond through social media. And let me tell you one of the tactics that we use that Drum used and Elron used. I'm not saying you use the exact tactic, but you may have to use similar tactics in terms of organizing yourself to get rid of these bums, because they're not going to represent you. Because you're living in a corporate state now, and a corporate state is going to eventually lead to fascism. You're going to eventually have no rights whatsoever. You're going to have a pass to get the bus on war. You understand what I'm saying? You see what's going on all of them down in this center. But one of the tactics we used to use, and that frightened them, is that we would pinpoint a foreman. We would write him up in the leaflets, say who his name was, we would say who his mama was, what he did, who he did it to, etc., etc., etc. And so that put a lot of pressure on them. And so you're going to have to maybe use those think about using tactics like that to get rid of some of these bums in the Democratic Party, Republican Party, which means you're probably going to have to establish your own party. But I'm throwing that out for some food for thought, that you're going to have to use different tactics and use the media that's within your disposal, because we fought a different fight. Because right now, the capitalists own all of the media, damn near, all of this stuff. But I'm going to let Ryan speak to the OSHA thing, because that was your question.
Relative to OSHA, it got established, if I remember right, but I'm not sure, it got established under Johnson. And we had the water, the EPA, and all of those all established in the late 60s. And we use those for the purposes of tactically trying to organize people. Now, let me just disagree with Alonzo in one sense. We, in the Communist Labor Party, had an experience which I adhere to this day. And that is that we ran General Baker in 1976 under the Communist Labor Party. Now, we didn't do all that well. So we ran General Baker in the Democratic Party in 1978. And that fundamentally changed our politics in that area, because you had the Washington politicians coming to this little district to make sure that General Baker didn't win that election. And my position is that's where the fight is. We have to have a fight in that party to destroy it. And if you look at history, how the splits occurred. The splits within the United Mine Workers occurred within the United Mine Workers. The splits within the labor movement occurred within the labor movement, and the CIO was established. Splits occur when there's a fight inside the organization. And that's why my position is I unite with Bernie in that sense. We have to then unite with that in order to cause that split to occur. Now, one of two things happen if we are successful. One, we take over the Democratic Party, or two, we split the Democratic Party. Either way, that's what we have to do. That's my view. And part of the reason for that is Bernie has a national voice. And we do have social media. That's all we got.
I didn't mean it like that.
That's all we got. We talk to each other. And that's important, our ability to talk to each other on social media. And in one of the papers that I wrote, I predicted that the Trump group will go after the elimination of net neutrality. So we have to be very careful about that. But that's my view is the tactics you bring about relate to the objective conditions you're in. And the objective conditions we are in right now is the corporate media controls all knowledge. We can't go to the plants and leave them. They're just too separate. So we have to figure out a way to talk to people, to talk to ourselves, to build a movement. And that movement can't be built just as we built a movement in the 1976-1978 with General Baker. General Baker didn't like the politics, but he loved the union. And so he ended up being much happier fighting inside the Ford plant. I was present at that time for when he was fired from Ford, because he went to Ford under a different name, and then after 2 years, the contract said he couldn't be fired, so he changed his name back to General Baker, and Ford said, "Hell with that, you're fired." We got it.
Thank you. I just want to give you a chance to ask your follow-up question.
Okay, I have one more question. When I came in, the young man was speaking on the DARE organization. And you mentioned a few times that Sheila Murphy was a part of DARE. And then you went on to list some of the things that DARE stood for and what they did. So I'm wondering, she was on the city council, and I didn't see any of that level of interaction, with her decisions and her voting. Did that surprise you with your research to see that she came from there, but then didn't act like she came from there on city council?
That's a great question. I think it goes to some of the comments about electoral politics that folks have been making. Now, you have particular, politicians, like forms of politicians and candidates. You have the folks who are willing to go in and run as Democrats, who participate in the electoral system, and they're willing to try to be disruptors, right? I mean, like these are, to a degree, Bernie Sanders was sort of like this until, I might have a chance to win, right? Like I don't think he thought he could win until people started coming out. I mean, so like I think he went in as a disruptor and sort of turned into a candidate that was, I don't want to use the word serious because I think disruption is serious, but one that is willing to sort of play the game to a degree in order to try to win. And I think Sheila Murphy, because you're absolutely right, if Cochran would end up being mayor, it would probably have been very similar. I mean, because I think part of it is, one, the structure of government is inherently conservative, right? I mean, so it's like if you're coming into a situation and you're surrounded by folks who claim to be liberal, but then most of their policies probably aren't, folks are for austerity, folks are, passing laws that will, help developers, corporations. They are, sort of like trying to recruit folks in order to break up unions, things of that nature, right? I mean, it's like it causes all these contradictions in sort of action and ideology and politics. So for someone like her to go in and, turn around and sort of just go with the status quo really wasn't surprising to me. Now, when it comes to my own personal politics, would it be something I liked? No. But in terms of just thinking about how folks who move in from activism into politics, who aren't seeing themselves as disruptors, it's sort of typical. Like, I mean, even talking with organizers, I remember talking to an organizer from the Ohio Public Interest Campaign, and it was a similar organization where they were opposing plant closings, and they were also running people for office. And one of the things that he said was, we just moved away from electoral politics because once we got people elected, we couldn't trust them. They went back on everything that they said, right? I mean, so it's like, and when it comes to folks who see themselves less as disruptors, more as trying to buy into the power structure, you always have to be careful, and there's always going to be those contradictions between the sorts of left politics that they practiced before and the politics that they will probably turn to when they're as their office holders, trying to get people to trying to raise money from private interests, trying to cut deals, right? I mean, there's something about government in itself that is inherently contradictory with the sort of radical politics folks who are practicing here, but then also contradictory in terms of, just one's own political ideals and what folks can do, because I just think it's inherently conservative.
Did you have an opinion on whether the computer changed racism?
Huh?
Did you have an opinion on the computers changing racism, making it less relevant?
I don't think computers will eliminate racism. I mean, I don't know as much, I'm not an engineer, so at best, I will read, news stories about artificial intelligence, and, there's some of the critical takes of it where folks will say that, well, white folks will build and, will mostly build and control, the technology, right? Or rich folks. So maybe this sort of biases, racial, gender, class, biases might be embedded into the technology. Do I know that? I don't know because I'm not an engineer. So when it comes
You
to,
can't make a computer loyal to a race.
that's not my argument, right? My argument is that there are folks who suggest that certain biases might be embedded in the technology. Now that doesn't mean I think that's true, I don't know. That's what I'm trying to say, is I don't know. When it comes to the issue of racism, I guess I'm a little more of a pessimist in the sense that I don't think what's going to eliminate, racism is probably going to be some form of, like it would have to be some sort of revolutionary disruption of society where folks who are from oppressed races, ethnicities, nationalities will take control over the economic system, culture, etc. That is probably the only hope. I don't think, that someone, who is on Silicon Valley is going to invent a robot that will eventually, free us all from that. I don't know. I'm not an engineer, so.
Got a live one over here.
I don't want to leave here and give y'all the impression that the women of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers did play a hell of a role in organizing an organization. Some of us were there from the beginning and helped to shape that organization. We, the women, ended up being a lot of the foundation to pull some of those people out of the plant once they became knowledgeable of themselves and what exploitation and oppression they were living upon at the time. And a lot of those women are still around and they're playing a hell of a role out here. They're revolutionaries. But at the same time, the conditions that created the League of Revolutionary Black Workers is not the same condition today. And we have to understand that. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers came on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement. And Alonzo spoke somewhat to that. And out of that, the workers began to fight not only against the question of racism, but the environment that they had to work in at that particular time, as well as the women began to come forward also within those factories. So it was a long, tedious fight, not only in the factory, we were in hospitals, we were all over the place. And in schools, because one of the best parts of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers was the fact that the students came forward and began to take on that rotten education that they were being given in the schools. And so, it was a lot of different arms. And to look back at some of the end of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and I think Russell said it, we were multinational like hell, and that felt good. Although at one time we were some hell of a nationalists, but we understood sooner or later through education, you got to have education. I'm talking about political education, and I'm not talking about political education and learning about who's running and all that type of stuff, and that ain't what Ron was talking about, but understanding, what you up against, and understanding you ain't gonna sit back and wait on somebody to fall out of the sky, nor are you going to wait for someone to tell you that you're the leader. You got to start understanding what kind of society you are living in and what will it look like in the future when you don't have to have money to buy anything. You don't have to have, in essence too, what about all these young people out here that are dying because they don't know what they're living for? It's society produces that. It's society to do that for the benefit of them to be able to continue to make their profits at the expense of everything. So, you got a job, we'll be here for you as long as we can, but we're dying off. And I'll leave you with one thing. We understood and were criticized by some young people. Came over my house and I got criticized by him all the time. This man came out of college straight to our house and he became Jimmy, my other son. But after we put Mitch and all of them out. Every night, you couldn't come in my house unless somebody was there doing something. But at the same time, you got to make the enemy stand up and respect you. And you can do that. But understand concretely that it's in your hands now. And it is not something that you were born with. You learn it. And you learn how to look at a science and see what the objective situation is calling for now. And what's the program going to be, and tactics, strategy and tactics in order to move. Again, I want to put this in your head. This is not the civil rights movement. Racism is a tool that was developed even before slavery to keep us all divided. If it's not that, it's the question of religion. They're going to use your mama against you in order to keep you divided. As long as racism is working, they're going to keep that. So, but as the class develops, and I've seen it happen in different fights around welfare rights, because some of the one section of the working class that was under attack, even before we even moved within the factories, was the welfare recipients. And now they have nothing on, because the safety net is gone. And so, you know, you got to learn those certain sections, like the old man said over there. Look at him turn his head.
Which old man?
They know what I'm talking about. But on the other hand, you got to understand the class question, and it's not hard to understand. And once it comes, once you begin to understand that, you go forward. Thank you.
One last comment. I just want to say that one of the things that when I became a revolutionary, in a lot of ways I view it, it was a lot easier to be a revolutionary. The world was revolutionary. The black movement was revolutionary. The Puerto Rican movement was revolutionary. The Vietnamese were led by communists and were kicking imperialism's ass. Africa, all the movements were led by socialists and communists. The PLO were almost all Marxists. It was a revolutionary period. We're not really in a period like that now. We're in a much more reactionary period on an international level. But one of the things that's made me very optimistic in the last period is we're finding in our organization, many youth are coming around. Most of them are 18 to 20 years old. They're studying Marxism. They're studying revolutionary ideology. They're serious about the struggle. And I'm convinced, and I always ask them, well, gee, what's bringing you? What motivated you when you were 12 years old to start reading Marx? And it's because they see no future in the system. And that's very important. One of the things that held back the struggle in the 60s was that capitalism, US capitalism, still enjoyed, it went into the 50s and 60s having 50% of the world market. Now it has less than 25, much less. It was powerful enough that it could essentially buy off a large section of particularly white workers in this country and provide them with enough that they saw their class interest not in solidarity with the most oppressed workers, but within the system. There's no question about it. It's what Lenin always described as the aristocracy of labor. My belief is computers have nothing to do with racism. It's created by people. And mostly it's created by the system, by the capitalist system that needs racism in order to survive. But the contradiction is that they create their own grave diggers too. And the lowering of wages overall for the working class, it can have two effects. One effect is Trump. It makes a lot of the workers more susceptible to backward and racist ideology, and that's not just in the US. You saw it in Britain with Brexit and with Le Pen. But at the same time, if there are revolutionary activists that are going to the workers as a whole and showing solidarity, concrete, and not compromising on the issues of racism and sexism and LGBTQ oppression and all the others, but going in an uncompromising way and showing that the only way forward is through solidarity, through following the lead of the oppressed, I really believe we can win people. But we got to build a movement that does it, and it's got to be a movement that's ideological in content. I don't believe the Democratic Party is going to change anything. I think, even to the sister's question, the politicians in Detroit were good to the extent that the social movement was good. When Mayor Young was good when he rode the stress movement into office.
That's right.
When the movement got lesser in Detroit, he was a privatizer. And he shut the, I remember we had a big coalition to stop privatization while Young was mayor. We had once had a very progressive city council. It wasn't them individually, as they were a product of a social movement. When the social movement had, what we have now, when they left the city council, was Joanne Watson and nobody else. And Sheila Cockrell is a complete sellout, and she's to the extreme of the sellout. Let's not mince our words about Sheila Cockrell. She's a spokesperson for the most reactionary sector. But I just want to end by saying, I really feel that this is a question of revolutionary struggle, studying the revolutionary ideology, and being activists. But first and foremost, the class struggle in this country is not just a class struggle, it's a struggle to defeat national oppression. It's a struggle where first and foremost is recognizing the right of self-determination for those most oppressed in the society, and we'll never have a revolution until that occurs. I just want to end by making an announcement, if I may. This Saturday, for those who have some time, there's a very important event. Reverend Edward Pinckney, who was a leader in Benton Harbor, a city that makes Detroit look like we're doing good. And he led the fight against police brutality there, and the fight against Whirlpool, and the fight against the taking over of the land from the black community in a lakefront city. It was put in jail for participating in a recall election, and the most flimsy reasons ever. He's finally gotten out of prison. To his credit, 67-year-old man served 2 years in prison for a crime that he never committed. We're having a welcome home at Reverend Pinckney this Saturday in Detroit. It's at St. Peter's, at St. Paul's Church. It's on Woodward, just north of West Grand Boulevard. I think it's, come and meet Edward Pinckney and we gotta show solidarity for our fighters and our elders who stand up. It's at 2 o'clock, and Pinckney will be there, and if anyone can contribute, we're trying to get a fund together that many groups are contributing to, and this is a joint effort of many organizations to welcome home Reverend Pinckney, and I really want to encourage people to come. And I also just want to point out, there's some leaflets there, especially for the younger people. There's a tour on January 22nd based on going the sites of the Black Rebellion. And among the leaders are Abiyomi Azikiwe, is a very, very excellent spokesperson in the Black struggle, but also Dorothy Eldridge, who was one of the founders of the People's Tribunal after the Algier massacre, police attack that sparked the rebellion. And it's a good chance to learn the history of Detroit, just like we had the privilege of learning it today. So I would encourage people to come out there and learn the city. This is a city with a revolutionary tradition, and let's all bring it back.
Thank you. I got some plugs, so in the spirit of solidarity, I want to ask you guys to consider a few things. One is myself and others are trying, well, they have already started what is called the General Baker Institute, which is to spread kind of not only the history and lessons from General Baker's life and activism and all those that were involved in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the CLP and later the League of Revolutionaries for a New America. So please, if you get a chance, look up the General Baker Institute, consider making a donation to help us get that off the ground and build it into the force that it should be. And then similarly, Semester in Detroit sponsors General Baker Scholarship for students from the Detroit area. So also consider going on the Semester in Detroit website and making a donation there if you can as well. And finally, I want to thank everybody for your participation and your patience tonight. Next week we have another panel, and this one involves General Baker as well as Marion Creamer too. It deals with the issue of housing policy in Detroit, from HUD housing policies in the 70s up to the shutting down of housing projects like the Brewster projects now. Marion and General both squatted in the Brewster projects to contest this initiative in the 80s. And then, of course, we're also going to talk about the issue of tax foreclosure. And we're going to have Mean Gene Cunningham here to talk about when you mentioned when the city council was progressive. Gene was a researcher for the city council, and actually pressure from social movements led to a shift in the nuisance abatement laws that allowed people to, if they were able to get in houses and then fix them up, they could then claim ownership of them. So you see how far we've come from that moment to what we have now, which is Dan Gilbert-backed land banking, where they're demoing houses, and if you're a resident, you can't get your hands on any of them. Right? So we'll talk about how we got there and the various shifts in policy. So please try and make it out to that one next week. It should be prescient, and I figure you'll have a not enjoyable time, but at least learn something from the broad swath of speakers that we have. But everyone, thank you, and have a good week.